Mind-brain identity theory, right? This is our third uh, theory, philosophical theory of the mind, or how we should talk about the mind. Remember, we had substance dualism, Descartes' view, and in certain ways, a very popular view, if you can tie it to the idea of a soul, which certainly Descartes did. The idea is that the mind is a non-physical entity. It's its own thing. It can exist independently of the physical world. And if you're religious, that makes sense because you think the soul, the part of you that's really you, is an immaterial thing and it'll just keep going somehow, even without this organism, the brain, that we now know is involved, at least correlates with all sorts of mental states. But if you're a substance dualist, then the brain is just sort of like a car you drive or something like that. You can get out of the car, you can get a different car. The brain is not essential to the mind on that view. And then we had behaviorism, we had psychological behaviorism, which says that well we can only study what's empirically verifiable. Souls or immaterial minds are not empirically verifiable, so we can't study them. Um, and we also can't study private mental events that only you have access to. What can the scientists, the researchers study? They can study behavior and the way that an organism, human or otherwise, whatever, reacts to stimuli in the environment and translates the stimuli into various behaviors, right? Those are the two main. Well, and then logical behaviorism, of course, says that mental terms can only refer to publicly, empirically verifiable or falsifiable uh, events. And that's going to be mostly behavior when it comes to mental terms, like pain, for example. On their view, would not refer to something that happens inside an immaterial soul. It cannot even be something that happens inside of you somehow, but not accessible to anyone else. It has to just refer to how you are likely to behave under certain conditions. Okay. Now we get to mind-brain identity theory, which, like behaviorism, um, is a reaction to substance dualism. So substance dualism is still not going to work as a scientific theory for all the reasons that we've mentioned, right? Mostly, we just can't verify that an immaterial entity exists. Right? So it's problematic, right? Remember Gilbert Ryle called substance dualism the doctrine of the ghost in the machine. The idea that we have a physical body, but then the real you, the ghostly you, is somehow connected with the physical body. But in what way and how, it's hard to say, right? It's hard. That's one of the main problems: is how does this ghostly thing interact with the physical thing? And look here, I made it look ghostly, but notice that it's still an extended thing, so it can't even be like that, because you could kind of imagine something like this, maybe pushing and pulling on the physical stuff, because it kind of looks physical, but the Cartesian soul isn't actually like this, right? It's supposed to be immaterial, so it's not extended at all. So how does something that's not in time and space interact with something in time and space? That's just left to mystery. So it doesn't really explain anything. Right? We want to know, what is the mind? How does it work? And we end up saying, if you're a substance dualist, well, it's this mysterious immaterial thing that we can't study scientifically. What what do you do with that? Maybe it's true, but from a scientific point of view, there's nothing to be done with that. You can't study it. You can't pursue it. So we want to get away from this. Behaviorists try to do this, of course, in their way, but there are huge problems for behaviorism as well. Not in terms of, is it good or bad science? There's lots of science to be done, lots of data to be gathered in terms of how an organism translates inputs to outputs. And, you can do all sorts of cool quantitative analysis. So you can do science. It's just that you're ignoring the very thing that you might be interested in if you're interested in the mind. You're ignoring, for example, the example that I gave last time, the actual feeling of pain, right? So, again, I'll pinch myself for philosophy really hard. Ow, right? Yes, you saw the input. The input is me pinching my skin right here, and you saw the output, me going, ow, right? Well, for the behaviorist, that's the whole story. But that can't be the whole story because I felt something, right? I was going to say in here, I felt it as though it's here, but I felt a physical sensation, this ouchy feeling. You didn't feel it, but I did, right? So it's very difficult to get away from the idea that there's stuff going on inside the black box and we want to know about it. The behaviorists are saying, well, we're going to stick to where it's easiest. We're going to look at the environment and then the behavior. It's a little bit like the old story about the person who loses their keys at night. They have no idea where they lost it. It could be anywhere in the street, uh, but the person is looking just where the street lamp is. Right? There's light there, so look over there. If you're otherwise you're stumbling around in the dark. Doesn't mean the key is there, right? Doesn't mean that that's the only place to look. So it's the same kind of thing here, right? It's just a lot brighter here if we just look at environment and behavior. What's inside the mind is it's very difficult to access. So the behaviorist just sort of says, let's just ignore that. Let's study what we can really have empirical access to. Right? But it seems problematic because it does seem as though there's something like pain going on here, and it's not just a stimulus and a response. There's something happening in between. So right around the same time, again, like I said, people are trying to get away from substance dualism. We tried that with behaviorism, but there were problems with behaviorism. But then brain science started to appear on the scene, or started to become more scientific, started finding out ways to scan the brain and see what's happening inside of it. Uh, and we're able to start correlating certain mental states with certain brain states. Even before we had this more advanced technology, we already knew something about the brain and the way that the role that it plays in mental states. The famous example is Phineas Gage, of course, with the railroad spike went through his head. Somehow he survived, but it completely altered his personality and his behavior. Presumably, it changed his mental states. And how did it do that? Well, by changing his brain states. Various other ways that this happens as well. When you think of degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's that target certain areas of the brain, and then suddenly lots of memory does not function correctly anymore, right? A memory is what we traditionally think of as a mental phenomena. And there are all sorts of other things like that as well. All sorts of examples where we see that someone's mental states have deteriorated in some way, and it's correlated directly with some sort of deterioration in the brain. Add to that things like drugs that target certain areas of the brain. Right? We know very well how things like dopamine work to create euphoric feelings, and the way that certain drugs can induce that. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right, SSRIs, that help to fight depression. We know how that works. That happens directly in the brain. Right? There's a purely physical component to that, and that definitely changes people's mental states. Right? Sometimes it's very, very powerful. So lots and lots of examples of the ways in which brain states at least are correlated with mental states, or the way that brain processes are correlated with mental processes or mental events. Lots of examples of this. And in the 50s, that was just getting going, just getting started. And now today, that has not stopped, right? The research area here is huge. And there's all sorts of different ways that we can now scan the brain, not just one way, but all sorts of different ways to target different areas and different processes. So that's the background. It's very easy to see why someone might then get the bright idea to think, well, maybe the mind and the brain are actually sort of the same thing. Maybe we've been making a distinction where there wasn't really a distinction to be made. So here's three of the most famous proponents, early proponents of mind-brain identity theory. You don't have to remember their names, but sometimes it's nice just to see that there's real people at work. You know, and the idea can be stated pretty simply. Mind-brain identity theory says that mental states just are brain states, and we can even say it the other way around. Brain states are what we've been calling mental states. So think of various different mental states. These are like the things that Descartes brought up, right? That he said these are the things that define the mind. Whatever the mind is, it is what is capable of having mental states. So wanting ice cream, thinking about Paris, being in pain, believing there's beer in the fridge, wanting a sip of coffee, taking a sip. Is taking a sip? No, taking a sip is not a mental event, is it? The taste of coffee, mental states. Well, those are all just certain states that the brain can be in. That's all it is. Right? So for every mental state or mental event, there's a corresponding brain state or brain event, and that's all there really is to it. They're just the same thing thought about in different ways. Let me explain that a little bit further. So to explain that, let me explain the idea of folk psychology. Folk psychology is a term that we give to our everyday, ordinary ways of thinking about people's behaviors and their mental states. We do this all the time, right? When we observe someone's behavior and we make certain guesses as to what they're thinking, what their mental states might be. If you see someone is yawning and not paying attention, you might say, okay, but maybe they're bored or maybe they're tired. Right? We can also predict people's behavior if we know their mental states. So this is just something that's necessary for human beings as we navigate our social reality and we deal with other people. We have to make guesses as to where they're coming from, what's going on in their head, what kind of behaviors we might expect from them, and which ones we won't. Whenever we do that, we're engaging in folk psychology, right? We're attributing certain mental states and making guesses about how that's going to affect their behavior. That's folk psychology. It's an essential part of being a social creature, right? So we engage in folk psychology all the time. Folk meaning everyday folk, everyone, right? It's not a scientific sort of a thing. Right? Doesn't mean it's unscientific. It's its own thing. It's been around for a long time. The ancient Egyptians were engaging in folk psychology as well. Right? So the identity theorist, the mind-brain identity theorist, says that those folk psychology statements that we make about other people's mental states, uh, we can ultimately really reduce them just to scientific statements about brain states. Right? It's all good and well. We can make these sort of folk psychology attributions of mental states, like she's bored or he's in pain, but scientifically, those are really just disguised statements about brain states. We just don't know about brain states, right? So we just call it something else. We give it some other sort of term like being in pain or being bored. It's very much in the same way that we have ordinary non-scientific ideas about water. We have a whole folk science of water. We've been talking about water, thinking about water for a very long time, right? Again, ancient Egyptians knew what water was. Right? It's that clear, odorless stuff that you can drink and uh, float boats on, falls out of the sky. And we have a way of identifying the stuff. We have a concept of water, but we didn't really know what it really was. What we now know is that water is H2O. So all our sort of pre-scientific, maybe pre-scientific is better than non-scientific, I don't know. These sort of non-scientific, everyday folk theory statements about water. They're all good and well, and we can say, oh, water is odorless and you need water to live and so on. But to have a scientific understanding of what water is, we have to understand that water is composed of these dihydrogen oxide molecules, right? These little molecules that have two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom bonded together. And it's that internal structure and composition that's what explains why water has all these features that it has. That explains all our folk theories about water that we had in the past. So anything we've said about water, we can just reduce it down to scientific statements about H2O molecules instead, because that's really what we've been talking about all the time. Right? So you can be talking about the same thing using different concepts. Right? You're still talking about the same thing. It's a little bit like the Clark Kent Superman example. And when you're thinking of Clark Kent, you're not exactly thinking of that person in a Superman way. Right? And when you're thinking of that person in the Superman way, you're not thinking of them in the Clark Kent way, but they're both referring to the same person. Right? So you can have different conceptions about the same thing. And the identity theorist rather says, yeah, we've been doing that with mental states, or we have this everyday concept of mental states that's referring to something real, but what is the real thing that it's referring to? Well, here brain science could step in and explain, right? It's really just brain states. So in the same way that we can say water really is just H2O, we can also say pain is just C fibers firing, where C fibers is something in the brain, right? Some brain structure that's has been correlated with pain. It's going to really, the science of it's going to be much more complicated than this, much more complex. It's fine just to use a simple example, right? Ultimately, what we're saying is pain is just some sort of brain state, something happening in the brain, some brain event. That's all pain really is. Just like water really is just H2O. We can talk about how water is clear and how it's thirst quenching and whatever we want to say, but there's just one kind of stuff there. That's all there is. Scientifically, there's just a bunch of molecules. And the structure of those molecules explains all those features that we associate with water, like being odorless and necessary for life, right? That structure is very important in terms of explaining all that. And the same thing over here. We have the concept of pain. We've been talking about pain for a long time, but now science can show what pain really is referring to, and it's just brain events. Well, what are the arguments for it? Well, it's a good way to explain the strong correlations that we find between mental states and brain states. Science has been showing this, that there's all these, and we don't just have to say states, we can say events, processes, capacities, all these different ways that we can talk about the mental world and the brain world. Here the idea is that whatever we say about mental states, mental events, mental processes, really, ultimately, those are just going to be brain states, brain events, brain processes. Right? And this is because we keep finding these two correlated whenever we do these scientific studies where we do imaging of the brain to try to focus on certain mental phenomena, and then we find, oh well, when you're engaged in this sort of mental activity, this part of the brain lights up, and when you do this part lights up. So we're finding all these very, very strong correlations, or the other way as well. You just whenever you find a certain mental state, you find a certain brain state, and when you find a certain brain state, you find a certain mental state. So they're correlated both ways over and over. Well, then you might say, well, that makes sense then if they're just really the same thing. Again, to bring water into it, it's the same basic kind of argument, right? Whenever we find water, and we look at it up close and we study it scientifically, we find out it's just a bunch of H2O molecules. So then after a while we'd say, okay, well, water then, whenever we find water, it's probably just H2O. And means that whenever we have a bunch of H2O molecules gather together, we know we've got some water. So it's the same sort of thing. So whenever you have this particular brain state, then we also find this mental state. And whenever we find that mental state, we also find the brain state. They're probably just the same thing. Whenever we find pain, we find C fibers firing. So pain is probably just C fibers firing. Now, it's just an explanation, right? You could explain strong correlation in different ways as well, but the important thing here is that substance dualism and behaviorism sure don't explain it. There's no implicit theory in either of these that explains these interesting scientific results. This often happens, right, when you have philosophers just thinking about things a priori, and then someone does a bunch of science, and we have to go back to the drawing board and start all over. Right? So maybe people were just not expecting the brain to be this very, very complex organism, or organ rather, very, very complex organ, intimately tied to all these mental states and mental events and mental realities in general. We weren't expecting that, but now that we found that, we need some sort of explanation. Substance dualism doesn't explain it. Behaviorism doesn't explain it. What if we just adopt this sort of simple view which says mental states just are brain states? There's a strict identity there. There's no mind-body interaction problem, like in substance dualism, because we're just dealing with physical events causing other physical events. There's no problem there. Right? So my decision, I've got desire for more coffee, I form an intention to drink more. It's a mental event, right? Under our folk psychology conception of it. And you think, oh, he's taking a sip of coffee because it sounds good. He can do it. Okay, so I had a mental event cause this physical event of me drinking coffee. If the mental event is just this immaterial entity, or an immaterial thing inside an immaterial entity, like on substance dualism, then we have a huge problem. How does that work? Here we don't have that problem because that mental state or that mental event of desiring coffee, it's just the brain state. And so it is the brain state, this physical state inside my skull, that ends up, sending out a bunch of electrical signals through my nervous system. You'll have to ask someone who's really familiar with how the science of that works. But we know the basic picture. It sends out these electrical signals, and then my hand goes up, reaches for the coffee, whatever the physical event is. It's all just a bunch of physical processes. So there's no mystery there, no ultimate mystery. There might be all sorts of things to discover about how that works, but there's no metaphysical puzzle about that. We understand how physical systems affect other physical systems. That happens all the time. Our brain is just another physical system, right, that's interacting with the rest of the organism, the whole body. So there's just no problem there. So that's nice. And I hinted at this already, really, right? It improves over dualism and behaviorism in various ways. Right? So behaviorism sort of just ignores or sometimes even denies the existence of mental states as anything more than just behavior. Right? That whole example of pinching myself and I feel pain. Right? I felt something, right? When I say I'm in pain, it's referring to that feeling. As far as I'm concerned, it's not referring to my behavior. So this was problematic for behaviorism. Mind-brain identity theory is not going to ignore that actual sensation of pain. It's just going to say that ultimately that sensation of pain is a physical state. And it's an improvement over dualism because we're not going to try to explain mental states and mental events by invoking this kind of a weird spiritual entity that we can't verify scientifically. So for many people, that's an improvement. not simply because, this has religious connotations, but also just because it's not clear that it's an intelligible idea, right? We can talk about there being some sort of thing, some sort of substance, and then we can say the words, and that substance is not extended in time or space. Sorry, it's not extended in space. Souls are supposed to be extended in time, but that's a whole other thing. My point here is, what are we really saying, right, when we say that an immaterial mind exists? I don't know if that's even false, right? That's what the logical positivist would probably say. Right? Say there's a soul that exists, but it exists outside of space altogether. Well, how would we know that it exists then? Yeah. The completeness of physics is another argument. The completeness of physics, it just says that whenever you have a physical event in the world, it was caused by other physical events. That's all it really is, and that you don't ever need to go beyond the physical world to explain a physical event. Sometimes it's put in this way that the physical universe that we live in is a closed system. Uh, Everything that happens within it can be explained by something else happening within it. Right? So all physical effects have physical causes which are sufficient enough to bring those effects about. So here's a physical event. I'm raising my hand. Okay. This would say that this physical event of me raising my hand can be explained completely by other physical things happening prior to it that cause that to happen. Now, if the mind is an immaterial thing, then we can't say that it was my intention to raise my hand that caused it to raise. Because the raising of my hand has to be explained physically on this idea. Of course, this is not a good argument if you don't agree with the completeness of physics, right? But this is a modern scientific kind of a view. So it would be a problem for dualism because, look, mental phenomena have effects in the physical world, right? This is at least on our folk psychology conception of it. Yeah, the decision to raise your hand can sometimes result in raising your hand. That choice, that decision, is a mental phenomena. The raising of the hand is physical, for sure. Now, when we say mental, does that mean something completely non-physical? If so, then the completeness of physics is wrong. But we think the completeness of physics is right. So it can't be this substance dualism view. But mind-brain identity theory, there's no problem because the raising of my hand happened because of some physical event inside my brain, not inside some immaterial entity that stands outside of the physical universe. Right? So if mental phenomena have effects in the physical world, and all effects in the physical world are ultimately caused by other physical events, it must just mean that mental phenomena are just a specific type of physical phenomena. You know? It might be a very fancy, weird kind, but they are a kind of physical phenomena. Okay. Now, for all this, if we were in class, we would take a lot longer to talk about all this, and you'd have questions, and I'd ask you questions. Um, Let me see. Was there anything else I wanted to say? No. Okay, so the main arguments, right? You get it. Strong correlation between mental states and brain states. That points towards mind-brain identity theory. And then also just the improvement. It's a better theory than dualism, substance dualism, or behaviorism. And it also jibes better with this idea that physics is complete. Every physical event has a physical explanation. So when you decide to do something, or when some mental state of yours causes a physical event to happen, it makes sense that the mental is just a brain state, that the mental state is a brain state. That way we're not violating the completeness of physics. Yeah, let me put this a different way. Okay. Uh, the idea that some events in the world are not caused by physical events, that's basically a supernaturalistic explanation of something, right? This is why science is trying to get away from that model altogether by saying, no, it just doesn't work that way. Right? We used to think that volcanoes had non-physical causes in some way, that there's some sort of spirit associated with it or something like that. And now we know, no, there's just physical events explain why earthquakes happen, why volcanoes happen. We don't have to go beyond the natural world. Now, here, if we're saying that mental phenomena, mental states, if they are not physical inside the physical world in some way, they would have to be supernatural. And so every time you do something, right, something happens in the physical world as a result of a mental state that you have, if substance dualism is right, then everything you do intentionally is a miracle. It's a supernatural event. I think about that for a little bit. We think of miracles as these very special things. But on this view, every time you do anything intentionally, your behavior can only be explained by going beyond the physical natural universe. Right? So that seems very strange, right? And so mind brain identity theory avoids that. It says no, your physical behavior is not that special. Your physical behavior cannot be explained only through a miracle. It can be explained by other physical events, things happening inside your brain. Problems for mind brain identity theory. Well, it's got all the same problems any physicalist theory is going to have. Okay, so we're going to skip over those for now because there's a lot of physicalist theories. Right? Physicalist theories being ones that reject Cartesian dualism because they reject the immaterial part of it. A physicalist says, no, there's just the physical natural world, the world of time and space. We don't, if there is anything beyond that, we sure don't know about it. Right? This is sort of a Kantian thing. Well, this is our world, right? It's a four-dimensional world. It's things happening in time and space. All these physicalist theories say that that's all there's to it, and there are no immaterial entities, or perhaps the idea of an immaterial entity doesn't even make sense. However you want to put it, these are all physicalist theories, and they all have objections or problems. But we want to focus on the problem that's specific to identity theory. Okay, so we will look at some problems with physicalism later on, but for now, just focusing on the problem with identity theory and why it moved, why philosophers left identity theory behind. Mostly, this is still a contentious issue, but many people thought there's a glaring problem that only functionalism can address. So let's look at that. The main problem is this problem of multiple realizability. It sounds fancy, but it's not that complicated, really. It's the idea that different physical systems could cause or realize the same mental states. Realize here meaning make real, not understanding. We're not talking about anything understanding anything. It just means different physical system potentially, theoretically, could realize the same mental states. What do we mean by that? Well, something like this. An octopus. Might an octopus be able to feel sensations? We don't necessarily know, but it's at least conceivable that an octopus could experience the feeling of pain. But our brain states are not the same. And so if we can both experience the same thing, pain, and yet we don't have the same brain states because our brains are completely different, then that means that pain cannot be identical with a particular brain state. Right? Go beyond that. Think about an alien, an intelligent alien comes down to Earth, an ET thing, ET kind of being, you befriended or something like that. You see it stubs its little alien toe, and it goes, ow! Uh, it makes sense to think, oh, it feels something like pain. Right? It's capable of feeling pain just like me. Well, so again, you're both feeling the same thing, pain. Let's imagine you both stubbed your toe at the same time. You're both holding your toe, going, ow, oh man, that hurts, in your own respective languages. You're engaging in the same pain behavior, as a behaviorist might put it. So you're feeling the same sensation, presumably, or at least conceivably. You're both feeling pain, and yet its brain state is going to be completely different from yours. It might not even have one brain right in its head. Maybe it's all dispersed throughout its whole body, whatever it might be. Right? It could have a completely different brain state and yet still feel pain. So if that's right, then it seems as though it's not quite correct to say that the mind is identical with the brain or that mental states are identical with brain states. Again, because you could have different brains realize or cause the same kinds of sensation or same kinds of mental states. Yeah, you see the problem there? Here, I'm going to use the phone analogy, right? Let's see, here's a phone. Okay, I've got a Facebook app on there. Now I know that there's nothing spooky about my phone. I know that the Facebook app, I downloaded it onto my phone, and now my phone its physical characteristics have changed, right? Its physical system, let's call it its brain, right? We call it the hardware, but let's call it the phone's brain has changed and now has this Facebook app. And I might be tempted to say, well, the Facebook app, I can talk about it and think about it in various ways, but ultimately it's just what's happening at the brain level of the phone. So it's identical with it in some way, but that's not entirely correct, right? You could have a Facebook app as well on a different kind of phone, right? Where your phone's brain is a little bit different from mine. We both have the same app, but we have a different brain that we're dealing with. Right? So that means that what defines a Facebook app is not the underlying hardware, because the underlying hardware can be different. What defines the Facebook app is the way that we can interact with it, right? The way that we put inputs into it, push on different things, right? Post pictures, the way we flick our finger up to scroll through it. We have certain inputs that we associate with certain outputs. There's a certain functionality to a Facebook app. That's what defines it. It's not the underlying hardware. Right? The underlying hardware is important, but the underlying hardware can be implemented in different ways to produce the same app. What makes it the same app? It's the fact that it has this functionality. Okay, so it's the same thing. That's what the functionalist is going to say. And it's the critique of mind-brain identity theory, basically. The functionalist says it can't be the underlying brain systems or brain states. It's the functionality that matters. It's the way in which a mental state is the in-between between an input and an output. If you go back to the behaviorist model, right, the mental state is inside the black box for sure. It is real. We should study it. But what defines it is the way that it takes an input and translates it to an output. What defines mental states are their functions, not what they're made up of. Right? In the same way that a Facebook app, anything can be a Facebook app as long as it can do what Facebook apps do, as long as it has the same kind of functionality. The underlying hardware doesn't matter all that much. That's going to be the point. So mental states can't just be simply identical in this very strict kind of way. Sure, it's very important, and we can say about the phone, again, to go back to that example, that here on my phone, this particular app, there's nothing going on besides just the physical stuff in my phone. We don't have to go beyond the physical stuff, and the phone brain is important to it, but the way we talk about it, we have to be very careful. That's what the functionalist is going to say. Now, you could still say multiple realizability isn't a problem because maybe we just have to be a little bit more specific and say that human mental states are identical with human brain states, octopus mental states are identical with octopus brain states, alien mental states are identical with alien brain states. We could do that. Um, this is still going to be problematic, though, because the whole point was, can't we say that the alien and I could have the same mental states? If we can have the same mental states, and yet we have different brain states, then we can't say that the mental states are identical with brain states. At least that's the way it seems. Okay, this is still, you might find some way around it. That's fine. And ultimately, the functionalist is not that far away from the brain identity theorist. Okay, the functionalists, at least scientifically minded ones, will say, well, it is the brain that's doing it all. The brain is really important, and we're not saying that a mental state can exist without a brain state or anything like that, or without some sort of physical state. That's the key issue there, is that for the functionalists, it could be different physical states that cause and realize the same mental states. Yeah. Okay, let me stop there. Then I'm going to record the functionalism one right away, I think, to just piggyback off of this one, because we had a nice little intro to it as well. So I'll go over some of this again in the next video. Okay, see you in a little bit.